Hey, how would this impact the economy? We know you're trying to fight inflation. I think 2025 could be one of the worst years yet. And so you would think that these congressmen and women who may have very little knowledge about economics and finance, here's their opportunity to kind of bounce some ideas and find out, hey, how would this impact the economy? We know you're trying to fight inflation. What would be the impact of this new legislation? Or what could we do, right? Could you give us some advice? Or what would you suggest we do to help fight inflation? What recommendations would you have for us on fiscal policy, right? You would think that that would be the purpose, but no. Anytime anybody asks Powell to comment on how a particular piece of legislation, whether it's fiscal policy or just, a regulation, he says, well, I can't answer that. I'm not allowed to talk about that. I can't talk about fiscal policy because, it's not my job. He talked about Volcker again. He brought his name up about how he did a good job in bringing down inflation. But Volcker also was very critical of the deficit spending that was going on during the 1970s and early 80s. And he was very specific in his warnings that government spending needed to be reduced, that we can't fight inflation with just monetary policy, that we need fiscal policy as well. We need contractionary fiscal policy, not these massive deficits. But Powell refuses to comment. And it's mainly because he doesn't want to be critical criticizing any piece of legislation. Of course, the Fed is very much to blame. It's not just the deficit spending of Biden, it's the monetary policy of the Fed. And of course, the Republicans never want to admit that a lot of the problem was caused prior to Biden becoming president. Just because we didn't see the inflation in the CPI when Trump was president doesn't mean that his deficit spending isn't partially responsible for the inflation that we're suffering now. Of course it is. And it's not just Trump, it's Obama and the Bushes. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. And of course, it's about to get a whole lot worse. For all the congratulatory talk about how the Fed has succeeded, Powell said in his prepared remarks that the Fed's tight monetary policy has really gone a long way in bringing inflation down from where it was to 3%-ish, wherever it is, and that we're on a glide path to 2%. The Fed didn't say, we better start hiking rates as we're getting closer to 2% because we don't want to overshoot. They had no problem overshooting 2% on the way up. But no. They want to make sure that there's no way they overshoot it on the way down. Again, this is all a bunch of BS. The government, Powell is just trying to justify creating more inflation, cutting interest rates, giving the economy the stimulus, like giving the drug addicts the drugs that he knows they need. So he's making up all these excuses so that the Fed could start cutting rates, even though inflation never even gets to 2%. When it comes to inflation, for the American public, it's heads they lose, tails inflation wins. Because you can never get low inflation. Because if we ever get low inflation, the Fed is determined to average it back up. So if we get lucky, we get a few years where inflation is low, well, now we've got to get high inflation to make up for that. But if we get a lot of years where inflation is high, we can never get years of really low inflation to make up for that. No, the Fed wants to make sure that it's 2%. But if it's 2%, we know it's not. It's much higher than 2%. And the reason that the Fed wants inflation is because it wants to inflate away the debt. It wants to make it so that Congress doesn't have to cut government spending and make the difficult political choices. The Fed wants to help destroy the value of the currency and inflate away these obligations. And that's what's really going to happen. When the dollar really starts to fall, that's when you're going to start to see the inflation in the US really start to pick up, because we've had these high inflation numbers during a period of time where the dollar's been relatively strong. Imagine how much worse it's going to get when the dollar's weak. We're not going to have to imagine that for much longer, because I think the dollar is going to be very weak. In fact, I think 2025 could be one of the worst years yet for the US dollar. I mean, it's kind of defied gravity, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's so many problems in other countries that people have been taking refuge in our currency. But I think that's going to flip once the Fed is cutting rates, and more importantly, once they go back to quantitative easing, which is around the corner. They may restart quantitative easing before the end of this year, but then I think the bottom is going to drop out of dollar. The reason the banks take so much risk is because the government guarantees the deposits. That is the problem. It's not capitalism. Elizabeth Warren is right. There's too much risk taking at the banks. I agree with her there. But the reason there's so much risk taking is the moral hazard created by the government that she created by backstopping all these banks, by telling all the bank customers, you don't have to worry about your bank failing because we're going to bail you out. Everything is insured by the government. That's what's causing all the risk. If the government didn't do that, if we had a free market in banks and depositors had to shop around because they were concerned about the risks that the banks took with their deposits, because when you're a bank depositor, you're a creditor of that bank. You're lending your money to the bank. You're an unsecured creditor, you're a depositor. And therefore, you should be concerned about the type of loans, the type of risk that that bank is taking with your money. But nobody is concerned about those risks because the government said, don't be concerned. Just put your money anywhere. Doesn't matter. The bank fails, you're going to get your money back. So there is no competition for safety. Imagine if that happened with other products. People do a lot of research before they buy, let's say, a television set. They go online, they look at consumer reports, they look at reviews. They want to find out which ones have a better picture, which one is more reliable. Same thing, or you buy a car. Think of how much you test drive, you go from dealership to dealership, you do a lot of research. Well, people don't do any research before they put hundreds of thousands of dollars in a bank. But if the government basically said, hey, just go buy any TV, and if anything goes wrong, we'll fix it for you. Buy a car, you don't need to worry. If anything goes wrong, we got it covered. Right? Well, people wouldn't shop around if the government said, don't worry. If anything goes wrong, we'll just reimburse you and make you whole. We want people to shop around. They used to shop around before Roosevelt screwed it all up. But at least when Roosevelt put the deposit insurance, it was a very low number. And what Roosevelt thought was that, okay, the little guy doesn't know which banks are good, but the bigger depositors do, and they'll keep all the banks honest. The large depositors, they'll shop around. They'll make sure the banks aren't taking on too much risk, except the government now basically bails out everybody. Every bank that has failed, nobody has lost money. Didn't matter how much they had there, they fully covered everybody. And so it's massive moral hazard. The reason the executives take this risk is because the government makes it possible. So don't blame banks for exploiting the game that you rigged. If you don't like what they're doing, then stop subsidizing it. Eliminate the guaranteed deposits, and then you'll eliminate the excessive risk taking because the customers won't let them do it. They won't have any customers if they take excessive risk. The only way that you can get rid of it now is even more regulation. But that's, two wrongs don't make a right. But the problem is, if you don't have the second wrong, you're going to have problems. More regulation just ushers in even worse problems than that. The other thing that I thought was interesting, it's not about that it's a concentration of jobs in government and healthcare. The problem is that government and healthcare jobs are not productive, and they're being paid for by the government, by the taxpayer, by deficits. That is a huge problem. Private sector jobs pay for themselves, and their employers get the money from the productivity of the workers. But government gets the money to pay its workers by running deficits.
Found this video insightful? Hit subscribe, turn the bell on, smash that thumbs up, and dive into the links in the description below. Join our vibrant community to ensure you never miss a video. Your generous support fuels our passion. Thank you for watching. We love you.